Welcome and welcome to you all. We are here discussing the art of running data-based campaigns. Guillaume, I'd like to start with you. You have spent considerable time in the US. You volunteered for Obama in 2008, which you have said has sort of taught you valuable lessons that you've then translated to the En Marche campaign when you worked for Emmanuel Macron in his run for the presidency. Very successful run, might I add. What would you describe are the ingredients of a successful campaign? If you give us a sort of overview, what do we need?
So today, a good campaign, well, the first thing you have to know is that in a campaign, you control 20 or 30% of what happens to you. So if Macron was elected, he ran a good campaign and he was lucky. But in that part that you control, the best combination is data, technology, and human. And this is what I learned when I knocked the doors. I literally knocked the doors for Barack Obama. Julius, I believe you did the same.
That's right.
And the magic of direct contact has actually been proven to be much more effective than any other campaign techniques when it comes to changing people's mind. And that's what Barack Obama did at a very large scale in 2008, 2012. And actually the first Frenchman to do that was not Emmanuel Macron, it was François Hollande in 2012. But Macron went beyond that. And instead of just knocking at the door to convince people to vote for him, he did something a bit different. He sent his volunteers to listen to French people, to try to understand what's in French people's mind, to start building a diagnostic of the country before actually launching his campaign. So, you can direct contact, amazingly effective to convince people to vote for you, but don't forget that listening is also amazingly important in politics, and sometimes we do forget that it's quite good to listen to citizens if you want to understand how you're going to change a country.
So Guillaume, you mentioned data, technology, and human. That's right, and human. And you made the point that humans are actually very important. Julius, you also not just volunteered for Barack Obama, you were one of his campaign strategists actually in 2008 and 2012. You were responsible for certain districts. You knocked on doors, as Guillaume just described. Can you help us understand a little bit more about that human aspect? So we think of certainly the Obama campaign as one of the most digital in history, right? It was always hailed as the social media campaign, etc. Explain to us again why the human aspect is actually perhaps more important, or at least the interplay of technology and data with humans.
Right.
What is that, the secret sauce here?
Well, the secret sauce, I think, first and foremost, is Barack Obama. The second secret ingredient is the context of that election. 2008 was a change election. I think that made most of the difference, that people went out and were actually excited to go and volunteer for Obama, just like they were for Macron. So, when you take the data component into the campaign, of course, everything becomes more effective. We analyze voter targets, and we can become more effective in talking to them and the messages that we send out to voters. But I think, again, Barack Obama managed to mobilize a nation. He managed to mobilize millions of volunteers. And just to give you some numbers, back in 2012, I was in Ohio, worked for the Obama campaign. The last 4 days of the Ohio campaign, this is what we call GOTV, Get Out the Vote. And this is where 21,000 volunteers will go out and knock on over 800,000 doors, have conversations with 350,000 people, and not just any people, and this is where data comes into play, they have the conversation with the right people. So people who are likely to vote for Barack Obama, but who are unlikely to actually show up. So young people, African Americans, Latinos, and those are people that real people talk to, explain to them why it's important to go actually vote. And then those people showed up to vote, and we won the election in 2012 by 103,000 votes. So data can make everything a lot more effective. It can be sort of the force multiplication effect, but first and foremost, you have to have the message, you have to have the right candidate, and you have to actually frame the election, what it's about, so that people actually show up.
So, Johannes, we heard now GOTV, Get Out the Vote, has a lot to do with volunteering. Data can help to know whose doors to knock on, but really it's an interplay of those three, right? Data, technology, and human. Would you say that on the European parliamentary stage, you've been involved in EU Parliament elections, you've also led German NGO advocacy efforts, so you sort of know the European and German context very well, and of course we want to translate all of the lessons from the US, as Guillaume has done in France, to the European context. So where do you see us in Europe stand on this interplay data, technology, human? Is there a different standard that we have when it comes to how those three interact?
Yeah, I mean, Julius explained what happened in the US, Guillaume explained what happened in France, but on the European level, I mean, most of it it's possible on a theoretical level, but not yet on a practical level. There are two main obstacles, I would say, when it comes to data-driven campaigns in Europe, on the European level right now. The first is that the quality of data really differs from country to country. So to run a data-driven pan-European campaign, you have to deal with a lot of different kinds and qualities of data. I'll give you one example. I mean, in this Bundestagswahl election, for example, I was trying to get data from city councils, city administrations in Germany. It was fairly easy. There were cooperatives that were sending me data in a format that I could use so that I could proceed with my software and so on. But if you would do the same, let's say in Romania or Bulgaria, you would find it much more difficult to get the same quality of data and the same format. So the data is the first obstacle. The second one is the way European election and European election campaigns are organized today. I mean, basically, essentially, European elections are the sum of 28 and unfortunately soon 27 national elections. And this is also the way the power is kind of distributed. The power is with the national parties when it comes to European election campaigns, not so much with the European parties. And we have seen with the last European elections that European elections get more Europeanized with the so-called Spitzenkandidaten, the leading candidates, Juncker for the Conservatives, Schulz for the Social Democrats, but we still have national voting lists and candidate lists. And I think one element to Europeanize the European election more and also get more European campaigns would be to have transnational candidates and transnational candidate lists. So we're not there yet, but we're on the way, I would say.
I actually add a third one, which is money. I mean, you look at the US and Clinton and Trump are spending billions of dollars. Hillary Clinton literally $1.3 billion. And then you look at some of the German election campaigns who are spending up to 25 million. So you actually need some money to build that infrastructure that you built for some candidates. But on a national level, there's actually not the money to build a sophisticated data operation that will build models on a daily given business. So I think money is a factor as well.
Not in other countries.
That's right.
And what about the human aspect here on the European level? Do you think it might be harder to literally get out the vote on a European level, to fight for something that it might not be even in my own capital, to fight on that level? Do you think it's harder to have people knocking on doors?
Yes, I mean there's still a distance between Brussels and the citizens. I think that's for sure. And the European level, the European institutions are working hard to narrow this distance, but maybe not as successful as they want to be. But I think the development that we have seen in the last election, 2014, which I just described, having European candidates, like for European parties, that's the right step to make a stronger connection between voters from the different countries to the national parties and the national candidates.
So, yeah. Did you want to have another one? No. Let's move into a little bit more detail, actually, on each of these. So let's start with data, since Guillaume said, data, technology, human. David, you have been called the Mark Zuckerberg of psychometrics. And psychometrics is a field, for those of us here in the room who might not know, combining psychology and analytics. So can you help us understand, we've heard a lot in the recent months, names are being thrown around, Cambridge Analytica and various professors at various universities who might have helped in one election or the other. Please help us understand what has actually been the major development in psychometrics, if you wish, in data analytics within campaigns. Where are we at? What is actually possible? How do you describe that development?
Sure, so what psychometrics is it's measuring what makes someone unique. So you can't put a ruler inside someone's brain, but you can ask some questions that tell you this person is driven by this, or they're motivated by that, or they're more outgoing, or they're more introverted. So what's changed in the last couple of years is that we've looked at is it possible to measure what makes someone unique from the existing data that's already out there. So instead of asking you questions, you look at what has your behavior been for the last 5 years on Facebook, on your mobile phone. And then you use that data to say what makes that person unique. And given that you've got this information, what is motivating someone, what drives someone, you can then craft the perfect message to that person as an individual. So you can say, here's the candidate, here's what you're interested in, and therefore I'm going to give you this message in a way that really plays to your interests, your motivations.
Now, before we go into a sort of assessment of what that means for politics, Guillaume, can you give us a practical example of how much you were able to use that in the French context? How much did the Macron campaign know about your voters? Give us an example of how you use that level of development.
So you may be surprised, but we do have privacy laws in France. That makes it actually, they're as strict as German laws. I'm very proud to do that. We French are as strict as Germans on some dimensions. And it's true with privacy laws. That makes it impossible to target people at the individual level. You can't do that. So what you have to do is like to work at an aggregate level. So for France, for example, what we did for Macron is we divided the country into 68,000 neighborhoods for which we have a lot of electoral history and all the census data, basically. And with that, you can start building a fairly decent predictive model to try to identify neighborhoods where the probability that you will meet someone that can change his mind during the campaign is higher than another. So I would say in like 68,000 neighborhoods, probably Macron focused on 20,000 in the whole country. And that was based on predictive modeling that would use not psychological data. Again, love to do that, but still fairly limited in my country.
Well, actually, this is interesting. You just said you would love to do that, right? Taking aside the privacy law, not to get any statement from you whether we should...
I would love to be able to use more data to improve the quality of the model.
Okay.
I think, actually I had a great conversation with Marlon Marshall. Was the deputy field director for Obama in 2012, and I think was the field director for Clinton. And we told him, it's amazing the data you have in the US. You can target people individually. So when you go in a building, you can actually know which door you have to knock at and which door you can avoid. And he said, okay, that's a nice story for the press. The truth is, when you go to a building, you just knock at all the doors. And trust me, when you wear Obama Yes We Can t-shirt, when you look at people's face, you know if they like Obama or not. So you don't need that much data. It's about combining, the amazing potential of data and targeting with the realities of a campaign, which is when you go into a building, distinguishing between doors doesn't really make sense because you would lose a lot of time just saying, oh, this door I do, this door I don't do. So you just knock at all the doors, but you have well-trained volunteers who have a good script, and the first question they ask to voters makes it possible to identify the type of voters they're facing, and then they can adapt a little bit their discourse. So my point is, I'd love to have more data because my model would be better, but I think aggregate level targeting is really decent enough, especially in Europe, where it's very recent. The idea of using data, technology, and having massive field campaign is fairly new. I mean, all the German party recently claimed they did that, but it's probably the first election when there was a coordinated effort across all parties to do that. So it's still very new. So my point is, I'd love when, to influence the law, though President Macron doesn't listen to me that way, unfortunately.
Which is his fault.
Completely his fault. But again, I think you can do a lot of great things with what exists today and working with aggregate level data without violating any laws. We do like to do that as French people, to go bubble, but...
Just to piggyback on that, you mentioned Marlon Marshall. His office was actually next to mine back in Missouri in 2008, but you're absolutely right. There's always a story about individual data, and there's this great fact about the Obama campaign that in 2012, if someone drove a Toyota Prius, there was 80% likelihood that that person was voting for Barack Obama. And, we got all the data points. Probably most of the German people in this room have what's called a payback card, bonus point system card. And the idea is that, of course, campaigns would use all that data to build predictive models to say, your likelihood of 68% chance that you're going to vote for Barack Obama. In the end, there's so much public data available in the US especially, based on your voter registration form, because almost everyone in the US has to actually actively register to vote, and we'll see exactly whether you voted last time or the time before, whether you registered as a Democrat or as a Republican, that information is actually most critical. On top of that, of course, there's demographic information, but let's even say that we have 20,000 or even 60,000 data points for each and every individual voter. Tell me one campaign in Europe that has the financial resources or the manpower or womanpower to actually build out all the creatives to individually target all these people, to develop different messages. And so I think that's where the hiccup is in the end, from a practical perspective for most European campaigns.
So financing, really, of that kind of a backdrop of an analytical back-end analysis machine. So, David, would you say that the level of detail that you just described, even though Guillaume and Julius said, either for financial reasons or for privacy law reasons are not actually possible to be translated into certain contexts, would you say it is something that we should strive for, to understand people at that granular a level? Do you find it, let's be blunt, positive? Is that a positive development, or what does that actually mean for political campaigns if we start, majorly targeting messages to such detailed a degree? Is that a positive development in your opinion?
So the first thing that's worth saying is I don't think this has happened so far. So Cambridge Analytica has come out after the election and said, we're the reason why Trump got elected, and it was because of our amazing psychology. And my personal view is the reason for that is, after 2016, they didn't have a client anymore. They needed new clients. So they gave this great story that then they could get business clients in future. But the other side of looking at it is, it's interesting. We're talking here about the importance of this kind of personal one-to-one connection. So talking to individuals face-to-face and really understanding them individually. And then we're also saying, well, we don't have much finance. So sort of, in the business world, the reason we moved away from one-to-one communication was not because it wasn't working, was because it was really expensive. And then we moved to this kind of internet world where everyone gets the same experience and it's very generic. And now we're saying, well, we've got the possibility to go back to one-to-one communication, albeit it's via the internet instead of via a person. So it's cheaper, but it's still giving you potentially the benefits of some of this kind of, being treated as an individual person rather than as a sort of a demographic group. So it's sort of, from a personal perspective, there's an argument that would I want a politician to be talking to me as an individual, or would I want a politician to be talking to me as a male between 30 and 40 from this geographic area? And actually, I would rather they talk to me as an individual. And given the possibility of using my data, does it really make sense that a politician says, well, it's better if I don't understand you better?
This is interesting. So how do you feel? Because you've sort of connected, the three of you have connected the data question with the human aspect of knocking on doors or a direct conversation, right? Really the point of the data question that others have been maybe falsely making, or at least have exaggerated their role in, as you said, David, is on a digital response side as well. The data is digital, but actually the messaging or the contact here, which you've described as one-on-one and messaging, is digital as well. Now, if you were able to, let's say, I'm imagining there to be maybe a chat room one-on-one, or if you're saying there is room for more interaction with citizens, how do you feel about the possibilities of detailed psychometric data opening up this world of digital one-on-one communication? Could you imagine that will ever play a bigger role in European campaigns as well? Because it certainly doesn't seem to right now, as you've said, that's not as big a part here. Could you imagine for there to be a positive side to this, if we can directly contact people because of that kind of data?
I mean, of course we want to get into direct conversation with people. And whether it's digital or personal, I always prefer personal because it's much easier to change somebody's opinion on something, or give them my opinion, create some sort of moment of empathy when we have a face-to-face conversation. At least that's my opinion. But of course, in politics, that's not always possible. There's 61.5 million voters in Germany, and you can't have a conversation with every one of those. So how do you organize it? That's the question. On a effectiveness level, when we say that there are roughly 220 million eligible voters in the US, I mean, you don't have to reach all of them. There are 50 states, but you don't go to all of them. In the end, this election in the US was decided by 79,000 voters. And so, of course, we can have the argument whether Cambridge Analytica actually used some of the psychometrics, what they claimed, at least in the beginning. Now I read that they didn't actually use it, so there might be a little flip-flop in there. But in the end, it's not about just convincing everyone, it's about finding the right people. And whether you convince someone based on a digital argument, whether you make sure that the right ad is in front of the right eyeballs, which we've seen even in this campaign that some of the ad buys, also made by some Russian entities, were just 1,000 rubles or so. You can convince a few people to show up or stay home, and that might be enough to change the election in the case of the 2016 election, just based on 79,000 votes.
Is there a difference in effectiveness, though, do you think? Is one or the other, is analog or digital potentially more effective in convincing someone of messaging, of one's own?
No, I mean, there's been a lot of scientific experiment. And there's a Bible, it's called Get Out the Vote by Gerber and Green. It's updated every year, and it summarizes everything you need to know about scientific campaigning. And it has consistently shown that direct contact is far more cost-effective, not just effective, cost-effective than any other campaign technique. And that even works in Germany. So surprisingly, German people are nice when you knock at their door. They do open the door and you can have a conversation. It's true as well for French people. One question which is a little bit related is, we're all talking about campaigns, but sometimes you campaign and sometimes you become president. It happens to people. And then what can you do about it? You just stop and use, how can you use data? How can you transform this idea of data, technology, and human when you govern? And I think that's what Macron had in mind when he did the Grande Marche, the long walk, this listening door-to-door operation. He wanted not to ask French people for the solutions to change the country, but that doesn't make sense. But he wanted to understand what was in their mind. How do they saw politics, especially people who were far away from politics? And now he's applying that as a president on Europe. So the Start En Marche will be launching next year the same campaign on Europe. If you want to change people's perception on Europe, you have to understand how they speak about Europe. I have no idea how people who vote for the National Front speak about Europe. All my friends, there's pro-European. I do live in London. My neighborhood, 95% pro-Remain. I mean, I have no idea how Brexit people think. That's a problem. I mean, I'm not a politician. But, if you want to do politics, you have to understand how people who are different than you think. And for that, I think that direct contact and direct conversation is amazingly powerful and much better at collecting relevant information than any digital tool. Right. But technology comes in to make the cost of organizing the campaign easier. That's, we didn't talk about technology. Technology is amazingly important to organize the millions of volunteers that knocked the doors on election day in 2012. So I'm not saying that it's only human. It's really the combination of data, technology, and human together that made great campaigns and possibly will improve the way we govern tomorrow.
And so that combination that you just mentioned is also potentially also provides a platform where to sort of collect ideas, you said, or at least collect the questions, collect the framing, right? Collect the rhetoric that people use, which brings me to a very important, let's say, fourth aspect of this. We've been speaking about data technology and humans, but really we haven't really looked at the actual candidate, at issues of authenticity, of narrative, of messaging, of framing. Johannes, you've written a book, and your main argument or one of the arguments is certainly that we don't just need fact-checking, we actually also need frame-checking. Can you explain to us what is the significance at this point in our political discourse of framing?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to question the importance of facts and the importance of fact-checking at all, of course. I think there's great value of facts, and that's not my point. But I think sometimes we focus too much on facts, and actually the way you persuade a person, maybe a voter, is not so much by the facts, but actually by the way you frame the facts. And I think the way I mean, framing a fact is basically giving an interpretation of a fact. The classical example of that is the way we talk about tax policy. I mean, we always speak about the tax burden, right? Something we don't want to have, something that is not nice, something we want to get rid of. And then we have formulations like tax havens, tax paradises, so places where we want to be actually to get rid of the tax burden. But if you think about it, is this healthy for democracy or for a welfare state which relies on people paying their taxes? I don't think so. So I think we should not only look at the question if a fact is right or wrong, we should also look at the frame, if that is actually in line with or in contrast to democratic principles and our common principles as a society.
Julius, on frames?
I think this also straight applies to a lot of people who are in the room right now, who might be looking for some money for their startup. In the US, you go out and you ask for a venture capital. And when you talk about venture capital, it's about venturing out. It's the westward movement. It's sort of off to new shores and give me more money so we can grow. In Germany, that translates into Risikokapital. So when we look at the two words, Risiko and Kapital, Everyone in Germany can just sort of ask themselves, like, what is the frame and the reference point for Risiko? Risiko, that's terrible. Germans are completely averse to Risiko. And we go out and ask people for Risikokapital. So I think that's a...
risk capital,
risk
yes.
capital,
yeah,
right. I figure most people in the room are German. But yeah, risk capital, that's not what you want to ask any German investor, definitely not a German bank for. So, you know, let's think about the frames that we use and what it might trigger in the person standing across from us.
David, do you see a danger in being able to frame your, your issues as a, speaking from a politician's point of view now, very, very tailored to whatever it is that I now know based on, the type of data you've been describing, that I now know people want to hear? Doesn't that lead to a sort of relativism of, my stand on certain things? Do you see that danger?
Yeah, so one thing that's interesting about personalizing so much is that you don't have this national conversation anymore. So you're getting different groups hearing different messages. Maybe they're hearing about tax different ways. So you're talking to the rich people and you're talking about the tax burden, and you're talking to the poor people and you're talking about a way that makes tax sound a lot more positive. So I think that national conversation is also very important in politics. So one thing that's different from commercial versus politics is commercial, it's fine if I get a very targeted recommendation that says you should listen to this music, and that's the perfect music for me, then that's brilliant. But when I get a perfect political message, that means I'm hearing a message that someone else isn't hearing. And then how can we as a society have a discussion with each other about what is actually going on? What is this sort of shared understanding of what's happening in our country?
That brings up the question of a shared narrative, right? That seems to have been lacking in certain recent campaigns, not so much clearly in the En Marche campaign. You've talked a lot about listening, Guillaume. Explain to us again how this process of listening has led to a certain messaging and how important that has been for now President Macron. It seems that was a big process of his entire campaign to actually come up with this sort of collective narrative, right? Something that we might have been missing on the German side a bit.
It was definitely part of it. I think there's a parallel to be made with startups. There's a motto that as a startup CEO, you have always to have that in mind, which is get out of the office. You cannot invent a great product if you stay in your office. Mm-hmm. Well, it's the same in politics. You cannot invent a great narrative, a powerful narrative, if you never test it with people and if you never listen to how people perceive it. And that's the idea of the listening campaign. I'll give one example. So the questions asked by the En Marche people were fairly simple, but there were two questions which were what works in France and what doesn't work in France. So trust me, people answered some stuff to the first question. But there's one that struck me. When people were asked what works in France, very often they would say schools. What doesn't work in France? The education system. So it seems contradictory, but actually it's the way people perceive the institution of national education, which is in Paris, far away, versus the school, which is close to them, where they send their kids. And so if you want to sell a reform on the education system, it's important to have this information. And actually Macron in his program, one dimension was to give more autonomy to local schools. I mean, he came directly for this, I'm not sure, I do hope so. But this kind of thing that you can understand. It does not necessarily create a great narrative for a candidate. I mean, and just one thing. We talked about data, technology, and human. You mentioned the candidate is important. Right. Of course, it's amazingly important. And you need to have a program. People don't care about the program for the election. But if you're elected, you need a program because then you need to have to do stuff. We should never forget about this. And the narrative, for me, I told Macron in a very, very early meeting, we had in the summer of 2015, a very early meeting, we're planning, all this and kind of dreaming of what could happen in the future. And I told him, if you want to become president, you have to make speeches that make people laugh and cry. And it never happened. He never made people laugh and cry. He made like an hour and a half speeches too long. But Obama was amazing at this. And if you look at like the last speech of look at the last speech of the 2008 Obama campaign. Amazing, and you'll cry for 14 minutes. Not longer, not an hour and a half. Right. 14 minutes, amazing speech. I remember every line.
Well, because also we talk about narrative. So it's a bunch of political consultants, scientists, journalists. We talk about narrative. What's narrative? Nobody uses the word narrative. It's story. And nobody can tell a story about the French election system, the French school system. Everyone has a story about their kid that goes to school. So let's do away with the narrative, the complex explanations of stuff. Let's start telling stories, and I think that's why Barack Obama was so effective, and that's why you cried through all the speeches. I did too. And so, that's how we convey emotions. That's how we create empathy, by telling stories and not by, following a narrative. Yeah.
So it's true. I mean, stories is basically the bridge between the abstract politics and the abstract policy level and the reality of a human being and of an individual person.
And
so I agree, storytelling is important in politics.
And the bridge between the data where we might be able to see certain stories and then turn them into a political, not just narrative, but actual tangible stories. Well, thank you very much. Some confessions from wonderfully emotional men when they hear Barack Obama. I feel and hear you very much. Thank you to the panel. That's it already. Thank you so much to Julius, David, Guillaume, and Johannes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.